Resume.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, I'm finally going to ask some questions of Stacey Wilkerson, who's been sitting here patiently for the last 2 days. So, Ms. Wilkerson, we're going to be dealing now with the riparian areas regulation, and you are the coordinator for the province since 2007.
Yes, I am.
First of all, I'm just going to ask you to identify the regulation because I think it might be useful to have that before us. That's in tab 3. And so this is just to identify this is the regulation that you are coordinating?
Yes, it is.
Implementation of, I'll have that marked, please.
Civic 1004.
Now, when exactly was the riparian areas regulation brought into force? I understand it was originally planned for 2005, but did that happen?
It was planned for March 31st, 2005, and then a decision was made to give local governments an extra year to get the appropriate bylaws into place to implement. So it actually came into force March 31st, 2006.
Okay, and it replaced the streamside protection regulation that had been in place previously?
Yes.
I have a couple of corrections that need to be made in the PPR, which I think I'll just do now. If you could bring that up, it's at it's PPR number 14, and if we can go to page 21 of that document. Right, the paragraph 42 just talks about the application of this regulation, and it says that the regulation applies to municipalities and regional districts in the Lower Mainland, on much of Vancouver Island, in the Islands Trust area, and in parts of the southern interior. It says adoption is voluntary for local governments, and that would be local governments which are not otherwise subject to the regulation. Is that right?
That's right.
All right, and the regulation itself sets out which municipalities and districts are subject to the regulation expressly, and that can be found in section 3, sub 1 of the regulation itself. Right?
Oh, yes, that's right.
Thank you. And then, sorry to jump around like this, if you could pull the PPR back up on the screen, paragraph 42, talking about where the regulation does apply in the physical sense. And the last sentence of paragraph 42 sets out all the physical areas that it does apply, and states the very last clause that it does not apply to estuarine areas, but it also doesn't apply to marine areas. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And one last correction on paragraph 44 of the PPR, actually the part of that paragraph that's on page 23. If you could keep moving to the next page. Oh, sorry, paragraph 45. So move to the next page. Okay, sub B that you see on the screen there says it's bylaws and permits under part 267 of the Local Government Act. It's actually supposed to be part 26. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Now I'll just ask Mr. Crow and Mr. Salome, was Canada involved in the development of you know what, before I go there, I'm just going to ask Ms. Wilkerson to just explain what the purpose of RAR is, just in a general overview sense, to set the stage for these questions.
The main purpose of RAR is to provide directives to local governments to protect riparian areas in accordance with the regulation.
Okay. And that would include developing setbacks to protect lakes and streams and things like that?
That's right.
All right. And so Mr. Crow and Mr. Salome, was Canada involved in the development of setbacks under RAR?
The determination of where the setbacks should be was sort of based upon a science paper that was crafted or written by both provincial and DFO scientists, and so yes, therefore DFO was engaged.
Right, and is that science paper at tab 15 of the Commission's documents? It's titled "The Technical Basis of Zone of Sensitivity Determinations under the Detailed Assessment Procedure of the Riparian Areas Regulation."
Yes.
Okay. That's, as you see at the bottom, it's authored by the Ministry of Environment and Fisheries, Oceans, Canada, and it's dated September 2007.
Yes.
Okay, I'll have that marked, please.
Exhibit 1005.
So once DFO was involved in that paper, was it involved any further in developing the standards under the regulation? Or was that left to the province?
No, my understanding is that DFO was actively engaged in with the province in development of the regulations. I would say I would be happy to have Ms. Wilkerson give her opinion, but my way I would describe it was that the province was the lead in the development of the regulation, and DFO provided a support role.
All right, is that your understanding?
Yeah, my understanding, I wasn't part of the process. My understanding is that a staff member from DFO regional headquarters was quite involved in the development in the early stages.
Right. And Mr. Salome, we talked about the 1992 development guidelines earlier, and it's been that those guidelines are marked as Exhibit 1001 now. Are you content with the setbacks in the riparian area regulation as compared with the 1992 development guidelines?
It depends on the type of stream. The land development guidelines prescribe 15 meter from top of bank protection zones for most streams, and 30 meters in the case of higher density development. The riparian area regulation applies different standards to different types of streams, and in many cases, for example, the smaller streams, the riparian area regulation is suggests at least an initial riparian zone that's smaller than that prescribed in the land development guidelines. And so your comment about am I content with it, I would say I'm not content with it in a significant portion of the smaller stream classes.
And why not? What's the concern that you have?
In short, I think the width prescribed in the riparian area regulation are inadequate to protect the stream and the stream functions and the riparian zone.
Primarily with small streams?
Yes, and some of the steeper streams.
Ms. Wilkerson, back to the operation of the regulation itself. There is a schedule of assessment methods that's referenced in the regulation, and that is in tab 11 of the Commission's documents. So this is a companion to the regulation itself, is that right?
That's right.
Right. And I'll have that marked, please.
Exhibit 1006.
How does that work?
This is the methodology that a qualified environmental professional must follow when carrying out a riparian areas regulation assessment. So it describes or prescribes how a qualified environmental professional, we call them QEPs, how they would establish the setback, and then it provides a set of mitigative measures that must be used to maintain the integrity of that setback. So these measures include assessments around danger trees, wind throw, slope stability, encroachment prevention, stormwater management, floodplain concerns, and sediment and erosion control.
Okay. And is the riparian area regulation, perhaps you can explain how the QEP works within the riparian area regulation. What is the theory of this regulation?
Well, it's a professional reliance model, and that means that before a proponent is able to develop, they need to hire an independent, qualified professional to undertake an assessment according to this methodology. And then that assessment comes to the province, DFO, and the local government before they can get their development approval.
Okay. And is the riparian area regulation implemented consistently across all regional districts?
No, it's not.
Why is that?
There's several approaches that local governments can take. We have some requirements around, they need to have a means of triggering assessment, or of obtaining assessment. They need to have a means of basically triggering the assessment when the development is proposed. But they can do this in several different ways. So local governments have chosen different ways to do this. They can also choose the tools that they want to use to implement. So they can use development permits. They can use zoning bylaws, as an example.
And has the province developed a guideline to assist local governments in implementing this regulation?
Yes.
Okay, and that's at tab 4 of the materials.
That's correct.
All right, I'll have that marked, please.
Exhibit 1007.
And this document sets out the roles and responsibilities of the different parties, including DFO and the province and local governments. Is that right?
That's correct.
I'd like to look at the different assessment methods that are contained in the schedule to the regulation. So if we can turn to Exhibit 106 again. Page 6 of that document identifies at the top there that there's 2 assessment methods, a simple assessment and a detailed assessment. Can you explain what is the simple assessment method?
The simple assessment is the assessment that was used originally under the Streamside Protection Regulation. And because it had already been adopted by some local governments, it was kept for the RAR as well. So the simple assessment looks at whether the stream is fish bearing or not. It looks at whether it's permanent flow or not, and how much vegetation or potential vegetation the area would be capable of supporting based on permanent structures that are already there. The detailed assessment was designed specifically for the riparian areas regulation, and it's a little more site specific based on stream characteristics, and it provides a setback and then the measures that I described earlier. So those are the main 2 differences.
Okay, and who decides whether a simple assessment will be used or a detailed assessment?
If a local government's already adopted the simple assessment in their bylaw, then that's the one that will be used. Otherwise, the QEP, the Qualified Environmental Professional, will be the one that decides what's more appropriate for the site.
All right, and will a detailed assessment always result in smaller setbacks than you would get using the simple assessment method?
Not always, no.
And are there any other benefits to using the detailed assessment? Like, is that where we hear about the mitigative measures, for example, that you referred to earlier?
That's right.
Okay. And I take it, just reflecting the comments that Mr. Salome had earlier, that a small stream will typically have a smaller setback using the detailed assessment than under the simple assessment?
That's right.
For the witnesses, Mr. Crow and Mr. Salome, if a proponent of a project is compliant with this regulation, I take it that means that there's an acceptance by DFO that there will be no HAD, is that right?
That's what's described in the department's code sign-off or support of the regulation.
Okay, so does Canada have any involvement then in the permitting stage, or I guess the application of this regulation? Does Canada get involved at all?
Our primary role will be in the circumstances where a proponent is looking for a variance to the setbacks prescribed once doing a simpler detailed assessment. DFO's Yeah, DFO is the agency responsible for granting of variances. Local governments have some limited ability, but our primary role is in that, is as it relates to consideration and granting of variances.
Okay, so if we can just understand how this works, if a development applicant wants to do a project, they look to the riparian areas regulation, they have a QEP who will come in and either use a simple or a detailed assessment to determine if there will be any HAD. And if it looks like there's going to be a HAD, they need to go to DFO for a variance on this project to allow it to be built in compliance with the Fisheries Act. Is that right?
Well, if they can comply with the SPIA, essentially...
The SPIA is
the
what?
Streamside Protection Enhancement Area. So once a simpler detailed assessment is completed, it'll determine essentially the line that the development should be set back from the water body. And that line is, that zone between the water and the setback is defined as the SPIA, Streamside Protection and Enhancement Area. So DFO has agreed that if an assessment methodology is completed appropriately and development can stay outside the SPIA, there will therefore not be a HAD. So it's a surrogate for our review and approval process.
Okay. And how does DFO assess variance applications? Is there some guidelines in place?
Yes. So in some circumstances, well, there's a range of circumstances. One is an individual has a development intention whereby they want to be closer to the water than the SPIA allows. And they can come forward and ask for a variance, and we can make a determination if we're going to grant it or not. There is a second category whereby after identifying the SPIA, the remaining parcel of property is so small because of the parcel size or configuration that it's literally not possible to put any kind of building or use that property in any, if essentially manner. And we have agreed to this principle of sterilization by which an individual has a right to use their property, and if the SPIA essentially sterilizes their property, they have the right to be considered for a variance so they can put something on their own land. So in those situations, we agree to that principle, and therefore will likely grant a variance. But then it gets quite complicated, which is how far back, what is the location, size, and configuration of that development. And if there's a HAD, then there's likely going to be an authorization with some form of compensation.
And there's a protocol, that's a draft protocol, I take it, for assessing variance applications that DFO uses, is that right?
Yeah, so there is...
If you can just confirm that, then I'll have it brought up on the screen.
Yes, there is a draft variance protocol.
And that's in tab 14 of Canada's documents. Is that the document that you're referring to?
That's correct, yes.
So I'll have that marked first, and then maybe you can explain a bit about it. Could you mark that, please?
1008.
Thank you.
Understanding the principles and objectives of RAR, and agreeing that in certain circumstances where there was a potential or likely sterilization of the property, and therefore a person would have what we deem to be an undue hardship, we would agree to granting them a variance. When the regulation was first passed, it was very confusing as to when a variance should be granted, and there was a great deal of negotiation and discussion with proponents as to if they have the right to a variance, well, what does that mean in terms of the use of their property? And often an individual would be trying to build a building too close to the water, too large, and essentially the effect would be substantial. As well as individuals were proposing and being supported by their local governments that they had an undue hardship, and we deemed them clearly not to have an undue hardship, and therefore they did not have a right to a variance. I'll use it as an example. An individual wanted a pool in front of their very nice home, and the local government agreed that it was an undue hardship that they did not have the right to have a pool. Another individual had a local government agree that if their building was set back further than their neighbors who had developed historically and were closer to the water, that it was an undue hardship that they did not have the same nice view that the other property owners would have by having their house set further back. So, and I could give more examples, but clearly there was too much uncertainty as to what was meant by undue hardship and where properties were to be located, so as well as size. So we essentially realized that we had to create a administrative tool to help provide guidance, consistency, and coherence to when variances were to be granted, as well as the location, size, and configuration of developments. And essentially this is what this document does, is it tries to become it was a tool we created to, between DFO and the Ministry of Environment, to provide essentially a methodology within the methodology to provide that that direction on how variances were to be managed.
All right. And just in the interest of time, I'm not going to take you to the PPR, but I'll note that in paragraph 52 of the PPR, we make reference to this document, but we don't identify it as a draft, and I just want you to confirm that this is still a draft document.
Yes, as the RAR is essentially agreed to by Ministry of Environment, DFO, and the Union of BC Municipalities. We still have not received agreement by the Union of BC Municipalities with regards to this variance protocol. So as essentially, we're using it operationally as a guidance tool, but it has not yet become a protocol within RAR.
And in the circumstances that you described where the local government was in favor of some of the variances that you described, like pools or better views and that sort of thing, what was DFO's role? Did DFO have to agree with the local government, or could DFO make its own decision on whether a variance should be granted?
Essentially, we make our own decisions where our decisions are not fettered, but at the same time, we do take others' opinions into consideration in our decisions, and essentially if two different levels of government were coming up with two different positions, we felt that was confusing for the public, for agency personnel, and therefore it was incumbent upon us to come up with a system, a tool to provide that coherence and consistency for all parties within RAR.
The model under RAR is, as you said, a reliance on professional certification. Ms. Wilkerson, does the province have any power to reject a QEP's assessment or to prevent development if the province is not satisfied with the QEP's assessment?
Well, it depends. Usually depends on the stage that we receive it. For instance, as reports are submitted to us, if we see that the assessment methodology has not been followed, or if the report is incorrect or incomplete, then we notify the local government that they're not in a position to approve or allow the development based on this assessment. If the QEP has not followed the assessment methodology, and they certified that they have, then they've made an incorrect certification, and so the report basically can't be accepted. So at that point, if we inform the local government, then generally we can we have that sort of power in that sense. But otherwise, once a report has come in and the local government has carried on with their development approvals, then no.
Okay, and the role of the province in trying to talk to local governments about whether they should accept a QEP assessment report, that's more of a persuasive role, I take it. That's not, the province doesn't actually have the power to say to a local government, you cannot accept this report if it's been certified.
Unless there are significant errors but no. And
as I understand it, the riparian areas regulation, what it does is it prohibits a local government from allowing development unless the local government has received that certified QEP assessment report for the development, right?
That's right.
Okay. And then that report sets out the setbacks or the SPIAs
Yes.
that are to be applied to protect riparian areas, right?
That's right.
And that report also sets out the assessment methods that were used by the QEP in doing its assessment.
That's right.
Okay. Other than that, the riparian areas regulation doesn't actually prescribe how the riparian areas protection should be implemented. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay, so it doesn't say that the local government must ensure that the SPIAs are protected in the manner set out in the QEP assessment report.
Well, in the regulation,
It's in the binder at tab 3.
Section 6 of the regulation directs local governments here to protect riparian areas in accordance with the regulation.
And the regulation simply requires them to get a QEP assessment report.
That's followed the methodology.
Okay, but it doesn't provide any requirement that the local government monitor to ensure that the QEP assessment report has been correctly implemented
No.
or anything like that?
No.
Okay. And so to address that, I take it the province in its guidebook, its implementation guidebook, which is Exhibit 1007, has tried to provide local governments with some guidance on how they can actually implement and ensure that these SPIAs are actually put in place and protected.
That's right. It sets out a number of tools and approaches that the local government can use. And they're just directed to use the powers available to them under Part 26 of the Local Government Act. So it's limited to that.
All right, and I'll just identify where that is in the exhibit, which is page 38 and following, sets out the implementation tools. And that's at tab 4. And the enforcement tools are set out at page 52.
Correct.
Sorry, it actually begins on page 51, sorry. Got that wrong. Sets out all compliance monitoring, and then the part that we're just looking at is the enforcement tools. Okay, so the RAR itself doesn't require a local government to use any of these enforcement tools. It's simply the guidebook tells them that these are available to them and encourages them to use them.
That's correct.
Okay. Has there been more involvement with Fisheries and Oceans in the implementation of RAR in the BC interior than in the Lower Fraser?
Yes, I would say that's true.
And do you know why that is?
I would suspect it's because of the nature of the development in the two areas. As Mr. Crow has described, there is, the BC interior has a number of very of large lakes, and these lakes are very popular places for people to live, and these lakes typically have very small lots that have been created. So these lots then often require variances, and that's when DFO needs to get involved.
I'd like to turn to the subject of monitoring under the regulation, or monitoring the effectiveness of the regulation. So start with, has there been an evaluation of compliance and effectiveness of the riparian areas regulation?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Has there been any evaluation of compliance with the regulation and an evaluation of the effectiveness of the regulation in protecting riparian areas?
Yes, we've started with compliance monitoring, and we're currently developing an effectiveness monitoring plan.
Okay, and are those monitoring strategies for both compliance and effectiveness within your job description? Is that where your
yes,
work?
Yes, the
Okay.
oversight of them.
Okay. So starting with compliance, in the first years after RAR was implemented, what kind of compliance monitoring did BC do?
Well, in 2007, we monitored every report that had been submitted to date. So we hired a crew to go out and look at every every assessment that had been submitted. In the years following that, we used the data we collected to help inform our monitoring strategy, and then we then monitored within this compliance monitoring framework that we had developed from that.
And now you said you went out to the sites. Did you also look at the QEP reports?
Yes, so for the first 3 years of implementation of the RAR, we looked at every report that was submitted as a paper audit. So we were checking essentially for correctness and completeness of the reports. After 3 years, we moved to just an audit function where we looked at 20% of the reports. Because we were comfortable that it had, we'd gotten to the level of compliance with reports that we had felt comfortable with.
And the QEP report reviews and the site visits, was that done in both the Lower Fraser and the South Coast generally? Like, was it done in all areas?
Yes, yeah.
And for the site visits, if a property owner first of all, let me ask, does a property owner have to give the ministry staff that are doing these site visit inspections access to their site to see whether they complied with the assessments?
Well, we would approach it, we would explain why we wanted access to their property, and generally people were cooperative. If they had concerns or decided that no, they didn't want us on their property, then we would work with the local government, who has the authority to go on site to check with bylaw compliance. However, if we felt that there was concerns because there was an infraction with Fisheries Act or Water Act, then we could send conservation officers. However, this didn't become much of an issue. The first summer when we looked at every report, I can't recall one where somebody flat out refused us.
We have in the materials a document which is at tab 13, and it's titled Compliance with the Riparian Areas Regulation Report on Monitoring Activities for Assessments submitted in 2007, and it's dated May 2009. Are you familiar with that document?
Yes.
Okay, can I have that mark, please?
Exhibit 1009.
These are the results of our monitoring that we did in 2008. So we're always monitoring the reports that were submitted the year before. So this is all based on site visits. It's not just the reports, it's the on paper, it's the site visits. And we looked at both developer and qualified environmental professional compliance.
Right, and it's got draft written across this document. Is there further changes expected to it?
No, not too many. It's something that just needs to be put through our ministry executive, our new ministry executive.
All right, and is a compliance monitoring plan, was a compliance monitoring plan developed as a result of this review?
This uses our monitoring plan that we developed based on the monitoring we did the year previously.
Okay.
So this report describes the methodology that we use.
All right, and was Canada involved in monitoring compliance or effectiveness, actually, of the regulation?
Not formally. We have no formal arrangements in place. However, I understand that last year DFO did contribute funds for our compliance monitoring, and there may have been staff that have come to some of the site visits.
Okay, and Mr. Crow or Mr. Salome, do you have anything to add on that? Canada's involvement in monitoring compliance or effectiveness of RAR?
No, nothing really to add. We relied on the province to lead the monitoring of the regulation. I do believe Ms. Wilkerson's correct in stating that there was some DFO staff that had participated, but I think it was definitely on an opportunistic basis.
Is the compliance data that is made available to the province compiled and then made available to the public?
Yes, once we remove the draft title, it will be made available to the public.
Okay, so as of today, there's been no compliance data made public?
Not yet, no.
Okay. And just looking at or talking about the work that was done to understand compliance, did you assess that there was satisfactory compliance in 2007?
No, we set our benchmark at receiving 90% compliance, and we did not achieve that. No.
Let's break it down then into components for local governments. Were local governments compliant in 2007 with the regulation?
If I recall, they were about 60% compliant.
Okay, so what kinds of non-compliance did you find with local governments?
So local government compliance, if they're not compliant, it means that they don't have the appropriate bylaws in place to trigger regulatory action and trigger the QEP assessment report. So there are a variety of ways they can implement. At that point, the 60% means that 60% of the local governments did have something in place to implement RAR. The other 40%, how they were not compliant varied. So there's a variety of ways they might not be on our notification system. In other words, they wouldn't be able to receive the reports. Others just had absolutely nothing in place for riparian protection, and others just hadn't brought in a bylaw that we felt was effective in meeting their RAR objectives.
So what was done to address that state of non-compliance for local governments?
Again, it would depend on the nature of the non-compliance. So we tried to sort of stratify them. It also depended on how concerned we were with that particular local government. Some local governments didn't have anything in place, but they're a small municipality that might have had one fish-bearing ditch compared to an entire regional district like the Columbia Shuswap that has very important fish habitat. We would work harder and I know that Mr. Crow will be speaking later to an important initiative in that regional district, the SLIP process. But generally, we would, depending on the local government, we would send advisory letters, warning letters, reminding of their obligations to implement. And a lot of it was staff working with staff in the local government to help them to provide support. We recognize that it takes a lot of time and effort to bring in new official community plans and development permits. So we were, fairly patient, but also tried to encourage them to implement as quickly as possible.
And have you seen improvements since 2007?
Yes.
And then moving to QEPs, which of course stands for Qualified Environmental Professionals. Yes. What was their compliance in 2007 when you did the review?
Well, it shows in the report a pie chart that says 48% of the non-compliance was attributable to QEPs. That doesn't mean that 48% of the QEPs were non-compliant. It means that 48% of the reports when we looked at the reports, 48% of the non-compliant situations that we saw were due to QEP errors, and these ranged from small errors that weren't as big of a concern as larger errors such as omitting a water course that was on the property that they didn't notice.
All right, and what was done to address the non-compliance that you observed with QEPs in 2007?
So once we do these audits, we provide feedback, the specific feedback from the site to the QEP to ensure that they're aware of where the error occurred. So it's an education for the QEP. If it was a serious concern, then we would have, more serious discussions with them and with the association that they would belong to. So to be a qualified environmental professional, you must belong to an association that's governed under an act in British Columbia. So there is that recourse through the association. We've used some of the information we've collected while compliance monitoring to improve the course we provide for QEPs. So there's a training course offered through Vancouver Island University, and it's offered throughout the province. And it essentially teaches QEPs the methodology on how they're supposed to submit these assessments. So we've made modifications to the course. to reflect some of these issues. And then we, from time to time, offer workshops for QEPs. We sort of tell them the top 10 things that we've found in the field that have been an issue.
The course that you described at Vancouver Island University, is that a mandatory course for QEPs?
It's not mandatory.
Has there been any improvement in the QEP reports, or however you described the 40% non-compliance? Has that improved? The issues improved since 2007?
Some of the issues have improved, and with report quality, I would say it's improved since I started looking at them. I think in general there's a greater understanding of what RAR is and what it's trying to achieve. However, we're still seeing some significant non-compliance on the ground with respect to the measures that I talked about earlier. And one of the reasons for this might be that the setbacks are based on a really prescriptive methodology, and they're almost always done correctly. With the measures, it's a little bit more subjective, and it might require different expertise. So we really rely on the QEP's expertise in that sense, and we find that those are the areas that we're finding the most issues.
And Mr. Crow and Mr. Salome, what has been Canada's experience with the QEP reports? Do you have anything to add to the observations that Ms. Wilkerson has made?
I think the one piece I would add is that I understand the concepts and ideas of professional alliance models, and we apply them regularly in DFO. I think some classifications of QEPs are not necessarily appropriate for being engaged in assessment of riparian areas, and therefore there is a number of QEPs that are I think not appropriate to be engaged in these assessments, particularly as it relates to, I don't believe they're bringing the right values into their judgments, and we would like to engage with the province in reviewing the types of professional classifications that could be participating in these assessments as QEPs. We have recently engaged with the province in identifying a number of QEPs that have been regularly creating problems in terms of quality of reports, and I think bringing the wrong values to their positions, and we're hoping to remedy those situations through their colleges. That was recent conversations between Ms. Wilkerson, myself, and others. And yeah, I think the professional reliance model is, I understand it, but I think that some of the systems within RAR that maybe allow a little bit more too much discretion among some individuals is being a problem for us.
Is it a concern that the QEPs you're discussing are not having a professional objectivity and they're advocating for the developer, or what's the problem that you're describing?
That's a very good way to put it. I would say that they do not understand the nature of habitat management in terms of cumulative incremental harms. They're clearly acting as advocates for their clients to achieve a development objective that's completely contrary to the intention of RAR and our agency's mandates.
And what about follow-up with the QEP reports? Are you satisfied with the ability that any of the regulatory agencies have to ensure that those reports are actually implemented appropriately on the sites?
My experience that there is not enough, there's not a sufficient strength within the regulation to require follow-up of by the property owners and their QEPs to ensure that the measures that are required within these RAR reports are completed as they were intended, and that it is an area that the regulation, and I would be happy to speak to the strengths of the regulation, but this is one area that definitely would need to be bolstered.
The intention of the regulation is not to have DFO or agency staff review the reports. And so your question about do we have issues with the reports, I would say we're not reviewing them. For the vast majority of the ones that occur in my area of responsibility, they're submitted to the online system, and we don't see the report. We don't get involved. So I think that's important to keep in mind when you say, do we have issues with the reports? That being said, we do get involved in reports where there's a variance being requested. In some municipalities or jurisdictions where they might have a higher standard than the riparian area regulation, a QEP and a proponent might bring forward a RAR detailed assessment as rationale why they might be allowed to go closer to the stream. In those situations, we often do see problems with QEP reports. One of the big things is, as was touched on by Stacy, the measures aren't well described in the guide or the assessment methodologies, yet the measures are one of the key things to ensure that we have a long-term functional riparian area. Other problems are QEPs perhaps missing water courses, in ravine scenarios perhaps missing the seepage areas or the important contributing areas around the water course, those kinds of things.
Moving on to developers, in your report, you talked about how 48% of the non-compliance issues could be attributed to the QEPs, but you also said in that report that 52% could be attributed to developer issues. So can you explain what that's about and what's been done to address those non-compliance issues?
Right, so by a developer, we're talking about either the landowner, which is generally the case, or it could be a larger developer. It's a little more difficult to address with developers because they tend to be sort of it's a one-time deal for them. They, you know, if it's the landowner, this is the only time they're going to do a riparian areas regulation assessment, and so with the QEP, you know, they are they continue to do them. We can sort of provide an education that way. With developers, it's a little more difficult. So some of the strategies we've used are through our compliance monitoring. It's an opportunity to talk to the developer and sort of explain this amenity that's on their property and how they can take care of it. So it's a stewardship approach. If it's a lot of times with a developer, if they haven't implemented the RAR, it's, you know, they've missed something in the assessment report that's really key, and they don't really understand it. So we try to get QEPs when they're going out and doing these assessments to actually talk to the developers. We found that some had actually, QEPs had done reports and never spoken with the landowner, which was, you know, fairly shocking to us. So that's something that we've really focused on in the QEP course. Make sure you talk to the developer and let them know, you know, why this is important. If there have been significant issues when we go out with compliance monitoring, then that's when we would look at enforcement, I guess, under local government bylaw or the Water Act or the Fisheries Act. However, with compliance monitoring, we haven't, there's the odd situation that we've come across that we've been quite concerned about, but for the most part, as was discussed earlier, the really big issues we tend to find through complaints. So if something fairly egregious has happened, we tend to hear about it before we monitor.
Okay. Then we've been talking about compliance monitoring. Has the province done anything to understand the effectiveness of the regulation? Has there been any effectiveness monitoring or assessment?
We are currently developing the effectiveness monitoring plan as part of the overall the provincial effectiveness monitoring strategy. So we're fitting the RAR monitoring sort of within that methodology. We've currently got a contractor who's looking at ways that we could develop an effectiveness monitoring plan for the RAR.
And what's the time frame for that being completed or implemented, I guess?
I can't say how long it will take to implement it. The time frame to develop it, I'm hoping that it won't be too much longer. Once this is developed, of course, it's going to have to be something that we'll probably have to work through a little bit more. We'll want to get DFO support to make sure that they're in agreement with how we're tackling this. So.
Okay, and you have an annual report on the implementation of RAR, which is at tab 13 of the materials. It's dated May 5, 2009. It's also still in draft. It'll just be up on the screen in a second.
That'll be marked as 1,010.
Okay, well, let me ask the client, or the witness, if she knows what it is first. That's okay. Is this a report you're familiar with?
Yes, I am.
Okay, now let's get it marked.
And we'll take a break.
It'll be marked as Exhibit 1,010. Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.